Hello, everyone. I am Barbara Gago, the founder and CEO at Pando. Pando is a performance platform designed to kill performance reviews and drive a more continuous calibration to help increase talent density and employee outcomes. We're really in an era of more distributed work, constant transformation. There's rapidly evolving, changing preferences, expectations, both on company side as well as individuals around what it means to grow and perform at work. And we're in desperate need of a new approach. So today we're going to talk about how we can treat employees not as cogs in a machine, but more like users in a thoughtfully designed experience. I'm very excited about this group of folks joining me for this conversation. All of you have spent a lot of time thinking about this, either doing it directly or indirectly, and also just a lot of philosophizing, which I've enjoyed doing with each of you as well. So I have Jessica Zwaan here. She's the Chief Operating Officer at Talentful. She's also the author of Built for People. She spends a lot of time talking about people as a product and really one of the early pioneers in this movement. Luke O'Mooney, head of people in recovery and founder at Sapien. And you're doing a lot of work around helping people organizations really transform the context in which they operate, turning people teams into growth teams, product leads, and so forth. And Erin Casali, you're head of product design at Xero, and you've got a mixed background in design, product, psychology, business technology, and more. So we've got a really good, diverse set of perspectives here that I'm looking forward to. Luke, Jessica, Erin, welcome, and thank you for being here.
So happy to be here.
Absolute pleasure.
All right, so this conversation is really all about rethinking HR and how we're using product design and more sort of commercial side principles to build performance systems that are useful, scalable, and more valuable to employees and organizations. We've talked a lot about this topic in various forms, but I think it's a really great opportunity. And so to start with the core concept of people as a product, I'll start with you, Jessica, in terms of just setting the stage of what do we mean when we say people as a product?
Great. So the way that I think about this is that your company is building three products. You have your consumer-facing product, your customer-facing product, which is accounting software if you're Xero, or it's performance management software if you're Pando. And a lot of your team obviously is spending all of their time fully invested in making that product the most amazing experience possible for your customers, having it be deeply aligned with their needs and solving their problems. Then you have a fiscal product, which generally your board or C-suite is spending most of their time thinking about. So that is either your shareholder value. If you're a publicly traded company, it might be your investors that are the customers here buying in through VC investment or like private equity. And there's also a lot of work that goes into making that product very successful. And then the final product is your employee experience, which I analogize to a subscription product. And it is my position that your people and even your operations team, but your people team really should be thinking about that employee experience like a subscription product that your customers, your employees are making an active decision to buy into month on month until they hand in their resignation. So really looking at that product funnel almost identically.
And we will talk more about the metrics piece, but one of the things that you've talked a lot about as well is employee lifetime value, the value created by employees in their tenure. So we'll dig into that more. But when we think about people as subscribers to your organization rather than just employees in this system, Luke, how do you think about how that changes the way that we think about those programs? Obviously, they're very outcome oriented and value generating. So what's the difference in approach?
Yeah, that one is a few key differences and things that we can draw from that. One of the places to start is that there's a product, there's a subscriber, consumer, and there's consumer choice, right? That's quite a big thing to factor in, because quite often it's been a one-directional relationship between employer and employee, and the employee is there in service of the business, and that's the relationship that's existed. Obviously, taking the view of employees as customers and a subscriber to that people experience product means that you have to shift your focus to value creation rather than service delivery, which HR often has been in a service mindset. Obviously,
Yeah.
this progressive way of thinking about PX as a product means that we can take a much more value-driven approach to creating value for end users. But it's worth noting that it is a two-way value-creating relationship. The employee also has a value to create for the business, and the business has a value to create for the end user. But simply put, that idea that our role as a people function is no longer just to create and administer policies. It's about thinking with intentionality. What is the product that we're creating for when people come to work and engage with work? And that is a massive shift in how we think, how we work, and how we prioritize what we're doing. So
Yeah.
I guess it changes the question from how do we get people in a performance perspective? How do we get people to complete the performance review to what problems does this solve for the employee by
Right.
making it usable? So just to put it into context of performance for this conversation, but is that idea that there's choice, there's value creation and relationship that exists that goes beyond the transaction.
Yeah. Well, I think a good point around value creation versus service delivery is that service delivery seems to be something that we go through the motions and we do, and we're like, okay, we need to do all these things. And value creation forces you to stop and ask why. For example, even with a performance review, why are you doing it? We have to do it, and it has to be done at this time of year, and this is the process. But what's the point? What are you actually getting out of this? What are employees getting out of it? What is the company even getting out of it? And so I think that alignment definitely serves also helping people to step back and ask that question. Erin, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, very briefly. I think they cover pretty beautifully. I definitely commit to the idea that, in a sense, the product exists as a function of the team that creates the product. So for me, working on a team, once I started my working on the more managerial side of things, it became natural because you can do whatever you want, and the product size has the most beautiful process, but ultimately is the team that makes it happen. And the best team people you have, if you can drive their performance, it drives the results. And the
Yeah.
consequence to anyone that pays attention shifts. And to me, as you all highlighted, is the mental shift, right? So the value added, absolutely. It's the matter of saying, okay, we have a group of people. If we think, just to add a new element, if we think, when you think about a product, we never focus on the negatives. A lot of performance often is driven by how we can fix things, how we can move people, how we can do layoffs sometimes for the people that are not performing, and we don't care about the others because they're doing well.
Yeah.
But if we're thinking in terms of product, that's a single thing, and it's a single thing directional in the pursuit of a better product. And so everyone needs to move on from the performance that needs support to the one that is excelling, because they're all driving it. And if we improve how we serve them, then we improve that for everyone.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting point about the team manifesting as the product and it being interchangeable. I think it's Conway's law. My husband's an engineer. He told me about it.
Yeah, I
But
use
it's like
Conway's
the
law all
way
the time.
that, yeah, teams are structured and communicate basically directly reflects what gets built or developed. So in this context, I think there's, taking a step back, there's team structure, there's a lot of things that evolve when you take this approach to having a more product-based mindset. And I think the outcomes that you can unlock are quite interesting. Okay, so we know that traditional HR kind of people-oriented programs tend to feel a lot of that is changing. A lot of the people here definitely doing things differently. A lot of the people we've talked to the last couple days, but there's definitely this shift from like top-down transactional feeling programs, especially around performance, like what performance reviews are often something that happens to you instead of something that you're even a participant in. So I think there's the cultural aspect and shift of that transformation that needs to happen. I'm curious from your perspective, Luke, what are some of the limitations? I know you work with a lot of different organizations and people leaders who are trying to make this transformation happen. So what are the common sort of conventional the limitations that we see in
Well,
performance systems or people programs.
I think performance systems and performance management in general is like the perfect archetypal example of what's wrong with traditional approaches to HR.
Yeah, I love you for saying that.
And the reason I say that, because I saw a lot of nodding, so I'm assuming there's some nodding going on in the audience too. The reason I say that is because they are solution focused in the sense that we come up with this idea of what performance management should be, and then we force it downwards. Whereas actually being product minded and being product led is actually the complete opposite. We need to be focused on being problem led. So really deeply understanding the problem that we're solving for. In this case, why do we need performance management? What even is performance in an organization? Where does the problem of performance show up most often? How do we know it exists? And really getting to grips with understanding what performance is, and then building a performance management program relative to the end users that are going to need to engage with it, and then building it around them, right? How are we going to make it usable? How are we going to make it so that engagement isn't something we have to drive? It's something that is built in to the way in which the system is designed. So I think that's the key differentiation. It's like you can take performance management or any other category of HR people programs, but the essence is, do we truly understand the problem that we're solving for? Are we just lifting and shifting best practices that have worked, or have worked in quotation, somewhere else, have been implemented somewhere else, and just plugging them in to our organization? Or do we actually understand what performance is in our organization and how we should support the management of that?
I think performance management is a good example because it is as waterfall as it gets. And from a product development perspective, we've moved well beyond waterfall for quite some time. So I think thinking about how those teams have also evolved their programs should tell us where we're at with some of this stuff. Jess, what do you think are some of the main things that are holding people leaders, HR teams back from this shift?
Yeah, I think so. I've got some kind of slightly controversial opinions about performance assessment, which is that so when you think about what performance assessment is now, basically, it's actually like a couple of things. And I think one of the challenges we have is we mush them all together. I think there's a historical reason why we do that. And that's because, like, going back to Conway's law, like for a very long time, the way that people communicated with each other was through paper and documentation. And we didn't have the same kind of access to complicated employment assessment systems, a way to kind of like see tracking trends over time in the same method. Like you would have to have basically a full-time data, not even data analyst. You need like I don't know if everyone remembers back in the day where people's jobs were actually to type things into Excel and into data systems. But that's the world that HR comes from, right? My first performance assessments back in the day when the dinosaurs roamed the earth were literally a piece of paper that was usually like filled in, or like even a Word document. And then we'd have a kind of offline conversation about things. And that world has changed massively now. And I think what we need to do is remove ourselves from the shackles of, we don't need to copy the paper system now onto the systems that exist in a world like Pando, right? It's a completely different world that we live in technologically. And I think it's a bad habit to say we need to have the same kind of structure. We need to have a form for each person that's identical, and we have a conversation that's exactly the same. When in reality, what a performance assessment process is a couple of things. The first one is you're basically trying to get a single like algorithmic or formulaic outcome that you can use to fairly distribute compensation across a company or make decisions, right? So to see reporting and to understand trends across your company. That is the same as you would be doing on like HubSpot for like lead qualifications or something like that. Right. Your customers never need to really know about that. All they need to know is that the system is doing that, is fair, and it's treating them well. But what customers do need to know about is involvement in what the product releases are, your NPS score and feeding things back, whether the product is serving them, giving them feedback. Those kinds of things don't need to be in the exact same format as we've been doing for all of time. I know this is not a particularly like helpful answer. I guess this is like me answering your question. What are the problems? And I think these are the primary things that hold us back from, doing a better job.
Just taking a process that existed in a different context and using it in this.
Exactly. It's trying to make it work.
That's exactly like the heart of the problem, isn't it? Because it becomes a compliance or tick box exercise that we have to do this thing. So we need to be able to document that we've done performance. like, okay, but why and how and who for and to what end? And are we actually measuring the impact of our performance program and performance management program through output and improved performance, or however we define it, or are we measuring it by rate of completion, let's say, which often is the case. I'll give a sort of semi-personal anecdote in that my wife has now left her job. So I felt like I couldn't talk about it before, but she's left and joined me. Silly woman. I don't know why she's done that for. She's suffering every day for it. But before that, she was working for a university in the UK, and their HR, honestly, their HR just, it frustrated me every single day when she'd come home and tell me about what HR had done that day. And I thought, oh my God, this is exactly why we have a problem. And one of them was around this like performance management process. And they were constantly getting nudged to fill out this survey and that survey and this self-assessment. And when my wife would push back and say, why, or when do you need this, or why is this important? They would say, just, we have to do it. Can you just do it so that I can tell HR it's done? It's like, why is this happening? Why is this a thing? And I think that is so often the case. And that's why I mentioned like performance management being the archetype of everything that's wrong with traditional HR, is because that's where I think it shows up so often as a point of frustration for managers and employees. No one
100%.
enjoys it.
And the way that we collect the data, like everything is wrong. And then what's the point of any of it? You're preaching to the choir. We actually have the middle school principal at the United Nations International School on our next session, and he's done some really interesting stuff, and his whole point, that will be about AI. We're not going to get into that now, but his whole point is that like he's been able to mainly disrupt the performance management aspect, all of these steps that were basically useless in his mind, and actually leverage AI to help him like be the human observer that is required to give great feedback to teachers. But the point is, it's first principles thinking, right? How do we just get back to what are the components, what are the things, and what is the why behind any of this stuff, so that we can then create something that actually makes sense. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, we're designing with employees in this context and not for them. So it's not so much of this like waterfall top-down thing. This is really about how do we use principles that we use in user research and user experience and prototyping, all that kind of stuff. Like we're designing products for users these days that have very high expectations. In the enterprise, we don't see the same quality of product. And I think that's where we have a really great opportunity. So Erin, I'll jump to you, since you spend a lot of your time doing this and obviously working with customers, but also employees. So what would be your kind of thoughts around how do we best involve employees in the design process around even, I think as Jessica mentioned, maybe it's not something that they needed to be involved in, similar to the HubSpot example. This is a revolutionary idea in that, oh, we're going to build this program together. It's not so much about us evaluating you. It's what are we actually going to get out of this and how are we going to create value? So what would be your advice on where to start and how to think about that?
I think that there are a bunch of layers, but I apologize. I need to do a step back here, because in order to do what you're asking me, like to involve the employees and everything, I think I want to go back a little bit to what Jessica, you were saying, or if I understood correctly. Because the first thing I realized that when I was starting to approach this is that actually within the question about performance, we are actually packaging multiple goals, right? Mm-hmm. Once we identify that, we realize that it cannot be a single initiative, because the moment we mesh together, and this is absolutely one thing you learn from design, is like you need to have a clear goal. The moment you split the performance, and to me, there are, loosely speaking, 4 different things that are. One is, are we driving, is this team driving forward to the deadline goals and everything that we're building? The second one is the individual personal growth. That is career, that is skills, doesn't quite matter how you frame it. Then there is an element how to deal with people that are not performing, which is a completely different issue. And finally, this whole needs to be tied together with the money side of things. And so if we start talking about involving employees, each one of these 4 is a different goal.
Yeah.
and they need to be involved in slightly different ways. Probably the only thing I can do in the time we have available today and to answer your question is to enable co-creation processes, which means involve the people, even in very simple ways, like asking, making sure that people are heard. And this is a key element that drives any great design and any good design out there, because the moment we start listening and building on that listening, then we can actually build and iterate and create great things later. So to me, that is, to answer back now to your question, that is the great principle that I find transversal to all these goals. And we can build from there. And one thing that I want to add here is that usually when I say this, people get scared. Then it's going to take 3 months just to do the research, gather the feedback, and everything. No, like depending on what you're doing, if you're sharpening your goal, this can be a very short activity. It doesn't have to be a huge amount of time or resources, but focus on the people first to get the insight you need to do everything else.
It's a really good point. And I would ask also, what's a good framework or structure potentially that people leaders can use? Because I also get anecdotal stories about they do listen and then they go and design, create, build things, and then people are like, oh, we don't have this or we don't have that. And they're like, but we did do this or we did do that, and there's still a disconnect. So I guess what would be your advice on keeping that loop tighter?
I think that unfortunately the reason why there is no feedback framework is that the framework that exists is too abstract. And the moment we are talking inside each and every organization, you need to have something that touches all the key points, but needs to be done in a different way. So we can absolutely take, for example, the classic design thinking process, emphasize, define, ideate, prototype, and so on, with the added element of iterate back when necessary.
Yeah.
But the shape that one take is a classic design, and it doesn't inform you beyond that, but it needs to be tailored for the specific needs and capabilities. Also, there is a huge difference if you have one person that is dedicated to this, or if you have a team of 10, right?
Sure.
So it's incredibly difficult. The key point is remember the principles that anchor the thinking.
Yeah.
So talk to people, involve, iterate, bring them in, and make that happen.
That makes a lot of sense. And Jessica, you've talked about this before in terms of team structure and makeup, and within people teams, the agile approach. So maybe you have some comments here as well in terms of how to get the input and how to do that co-creation while still operating as a people function.
Yeah, I think specifically when it comes to things like performance, like I got to take an approach where my team is constantly trying to seek feedback from customer facing things. Like this is an important part of it. Like from my perspective, I think you should be making, I think Erin touched on this pretty effectively, is like the work you're doing that's customer facing will need to be something that you are creating that is maybe a little more unique to your circumstances, maybe a bit more specific to your customer base, like your needs, like what are you actually trying to get out of it? Like that should be something that is like much more adapted. I think the back end facing stuff I'm talking about, so like what you do with those performance outcomes and how you turn them into a salary change, that actually does not need to be custom at all, pretty much, unless your like compensation framework is highly complex and you need to make sure that the formula fits your needs. But that work doesn't need to be customer facing. You don't really need to use a test it as long as you're getting consistent outcomes. The data should tell you what you need to know. If you're seeing pay gaps exist, there's something wrong with your process. But if you're getting bad feedback on the fact that people get a number at the end of their performance review, then the problem is that should never be user facing. And when you're creating your performance assessment, like the questions you're asking, the way that you're communicating it, there's a lot more than just the tool you're using, as I'm sure you have so many customers that talk to you about this. There's more than just the tool you're using. There's also like the way that it's embedded in the company, the way it's spoken about, the amount of time things take. Like that's another part of the experience, right? Like how long or short is this experience going to be? And I think for the way that I think about my team is really trying to do more than just surveys. I'm not a huge fan of just sending out lots of surveys to people. Wherever is ethical, do A/B testing. Maybe that means in the US, you communicate in one way, in the UK, you communicate in another way to try and understand. Do people prefer lots of long procedural information, or do they prefer like a short dot point information? And then the other thing that I really love to do with my team is it's almost kind of user testing in a real-time environment. I will literally put something in front of a manager, for example. So recently we just launched a part of our performance assessment process annually, but it only happens once a year. And it's very much focused on feedback, growth, conversation. It's not tracked, it's not logged. It's just something that is there to encourage a conversation. And what we did with the communications and the forms and the process is I just literally called up some of my managers and said, I'm going to screen share with you some things. I want you to look at them and then tell me what it is you're looking at. What are the questions I'm asking you to do? Do you know how to use this? What's your biggest takeaway? Read this communication. And then at the end of it, I'm going to ask you some questions to try and get a feel for whether people are going to be able to independently understand what you're creating for them or whether they're going to struggle and it's going to cause you problems.
That makes sense. I like that. And it's, you do it with, you design web pages, you do whatever, you watch how people look. Do they click on the right thing? So it's like user testing, stress testing your program.
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. Luke, do you want to add anything here?
Definitely just echoing everything that's been said, really. A big problem that happens is that people rely too much on surveying, like Jesse said, and actually a lot of that information is irrelevant or service level, doesn't quite get to the heart of the problem. And there's also this sort of strange disconnect between the feedback being received and the closing that loop in some way, which is very frustrating for most people and will cause disengagement more broadly as you try and get more high quality information. And I think there's value in doing things that don't scale when it comes to user feedback. And it might seem, yes, of course you can scale feedback more quickly through surveys, but actually having a few select very specific one-to-one feedback sessions or group feedback sessions with specifically affected end users, you're going to derive a lot higher quality feedback from that. And just a sort of anecdotal note on feedback, one of the things that I get pushback on sometimes when I'm talking to people about being product-led and user research, building with employees and end users, is if we just build everything they want, like maybe we're just going to be busy creating this circus of entertainment almost. But it's crucial to remember that you need to still maintain a rigor and a process to how you decide what to prioritize and how you put that feedback into development.
Right.
And I like to use I don't know if he actually said this, but there's a quote that attributed to Henry Ford, which is, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And so there's always this balance between understanding what is high value feedback that we can put into action and which is interesting to know. We can feedback that we've acknowledged it, but it's not something we need to carry forward into development. And I think that's a skill that just needs to be practiced.
Yeah. And I would add tactically, we did a project with one of our customers, for example, to build employee personas in the context of the program. So it was the individual contributor, this is the manager, this is the executive, this is the persona of these people. These are their challenges, these are their pain points, all within the context of performance management or whatever the program is, so that there's clarity around, and obviously you can get inputs on that, but even just going through that exercise, you then, when you start thinking about designing the program, can verify, does this actually solve for these pain points that this user profile has or this user profile has, and also, of course, come up with solutions that will, if not. And the other thing I would say, just in terms of leveraging product design sort of cadences, ceremonies, etc., doing retrospectives with managers is really easy, like super low lift, easy way to just either stop, start, continue, or what they liked, what they hated, what they wish they had, like whatever it is. We use a lot of Miro boards for this kind of thing. It's very easy. People feel like they're heard and they're engaged in the process. And it's not a lot of effort on your part to set up, but it's a way to get feedback that doesn't feel super official or something like that. And you can do those after different initiatives, launches, etc. So those are just like a couple little things that I've seen have been pretty effective too.
Couple builds on that. I think one of the core lean in manufacturing and product, one of the primary outcomes is to eliminate waste, right? Waste as defined as anything that doesn't add value to the end user.
Yeah.
And for anyone listening who's thinking about where do I start with unpacking a performance management system or program that's in place, I'll start there. Understand, as you were talking about, Barbara, who are your end users and how can you categorize them into key persona groups? Then start examining the processes in place relative to waste. Which parts of this actually don't create value to the end user? Well, actually, we can just take that out, and that immediately simplifies the process and improves the experience. And then the other thing is, because I'm going to speak from the context of startup scale-ups, because that's where I spend most of my time. Often your time and resource light. So I also encourage the adoption of the create for the worst affected end user approach. So like focusing in on which of your user groups are most affected by this performance management program, solving that first, because likely you're going to improve the process for all of the users too, but it also gets you to focus in on the most high impact area to begin with, because it can feel pretty overwhelming sometimes to think about the idea of overhauling performance management.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, last kind of topic. We have a few minutes left, so I want to talk a bit about metrics and measures. Luke, you mentioned earlier, some companies are still measuring if people are completing performance reviews, for example, but when we're thinking about people as a product, and not just around performance, but just in general, what are some of the product specific metrics that we should be thinking about? And Jessica, I'll start with you. I know I alluded to this earlier, but ELTV is one of my favorite. You have many that you talk about.
I feel like this is very fresh on top of my mind right now. Okay, so I think there are three groups of metrics broadly that I think about. You've got like health metrics, which is things like you're sharing with your board, and things like how many headcount do we have? What's the split between the different functions? Just like understanding the kind of operational fundamentals of your team. And then you have the metrics you're using to track and understand broad macro level performance or trends or things you need to understand from like a potentially like a financial metric position. And that's things like, what's our offer acceptance rate? What's our time to fill? What's our performance distributions quarter on quarter? So it's things you're comparing usually against time, trying to understand how are you tracking overall in terms of your performance as a team. And then the third type of metrics I think about a lot is like success metrics, which is usually something very specific you're using to identify whether or not you've solved a problem statement or proven a hypothesis that you're trying to make as a team. So that thing may be like, we're noticing poor pass-through rates from good quality interview feedback through to probation failing. It's causing our onboarding and recruitment costs to spiral to X amount. And it's also costing us revenue because this is primarily impacting the sales team. And this is the scale of the problem, right? So that's like a problem statement you may craft. And then you go away and you do some research and hypothesize like what's causing this problem. Now, I think like maybe a traditional HR team may say our probation process needs to be reviewed because that's where the problem is manifesting. But I think a people operations as a product team might go away and do a bunch of research, look at all the data and say, actually, what we've noticed is we're seeing there's some specific interviewers in the sales team that are overly generous in their interview feedback. And the problem is actually not necessarily poor probation pass-through rates. It's actually much too positive interview feedback, and the interview feedback is not appropriately calibrated. So then you may set a metric, which is two things. It's one thing is trying to see a more even distribution of interview feedback within that team. Now, I don't think you should be like grading against the curve necessarily, but you're trying to see something that's like a bit more representative of what you'd expect in the market. So that may be one success metric, is seeing our interview feedback more normalized. And the other success metric you may see is that we're seeing more appropriate probation pass-through rates due to higher quality interviewing, right? Now, those two things are metrics that you may only look at for 1, 2, 3 quarters because you're trying to identify if you've solved a problem. And my team is constantly trying to look at like comparative metrics to try and figure out if we're solving problems. So we're not just looking at how many sick days we take in, but how many sick days we're taking in a specific team where high performance is something that we're worried about, for example. So you're trying to like get to a specific specificity. So that's one whole rant about metrics. And the other small rant is you and I both have this kind of white whale of the employee lifetime value to CAC payback ratio, which I think is the most perfect comparative metric that you could potentially try and find in the people team. Now, there's no way to perfectly get this, but I will say, like, even in marketing, and you know this very well, Barbara, even in marketing, getting acquisition cost can be very difficult, right? In marketing, the challenge is acquisition and attribution. And in HR, it's performance and being able to attribute lifetime value to a member of your team. But I do think that through like very high quality performance assessment, you probably are able to get to a place where you can at least have a pretty broad understanding on an ARR per head basis of how effective your organizational design is, how quickly your team can become onboarded and contribute value, whether that be growth or ARR. And I think if you're able to get to a place where you feel pretty confident that you're looking at the right kinds of numbers, if nothing else, even if you're like, this isn't perfectly accurate, I'm not going to submit this to some kind of like peer assessment paper, it should be moving you in the right direction, which is trying to balance having a consistently high performing team, a really beautiful org design that has no flab in it that's not ineffective, and measuring and maintaining a like sustainable cost base of your HR team to deliver those things. End of rant.
Amazing. I think just to add one last thing, something that I've been really interested in is thinking about, and it was something that also comes from sales and marketing, is like the velocity metric of getting things through the funnel, like your high quality leads. And so thinking like that's the more advanced stages, I guess, but thinking about like growth rate as a way to compound this impact that this ELTV essentially. But we are out of time. We could probably spend another hour or 2 or 3 or 4. I really want to thank all of you for joining us. Jessica, Luke, Erin, really appreciate you making time to share your insights and have this conversation with me. Thank you everyone for being here and have a great day. See you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, team.